Welcome everyone, and thank you for signing up and attending today's erosion management for Western Lake Ontario workshop presented by New York Sea Grant, New York DEC, Department of State, and the Army Corps of Engineers. I just want to quickly check that everybody can see a full screen of a PowerPoint image right now. Is that good?
I may need to use your computer.
Computer? Okay, you want to?
Yeah. It's
You guys check on the mutes, make sure everybody's muted that's not speaking. Again, thank you for coming in today.
Is the trailer at the cottage?
All right. Thank you for coming today. I'm going to go over a little bit of background on this and some ground rules and some housekeeping, just to let you guys know what's going to go on today. Let's get right into this. I just wanted to say that this is being recorded so that people that weren't able to attend today can come back and check it at a later date. So we also have kind of this standalone presentation online for those that are interested that may not have heard about this yet. Quickly, some ground rules. Okay, so sometimes living on lakes is a contentious issue. This is not a lake level discussion. We are here today to talk about, the erosion issues and flooding issues that we're having in the lake and how to combat those on your own property, how to work with your neighbors to make sure that you're doing it in a considerate way, and also some of the ecological impacts and also the permitting and processes behind all of this and the influences that your own shoreline has on the coastal processes around. So if you have questions, don't be afraid to put them into the chat box and we will be monitoring those. For the most part, we will answer a couple questions after each presentation, but we do have some time built in at the end in which we can do more of a panel discussion. So the way we'll start, I'll talk a little bit about living on the shoreline, especially with a focus on the Niagara and Orleans County areas. We have 3 speakers from DEC who will talk about permitting and CHA on that's the coastal erosion hazard areas on their end. We will also hear from New York State Department of State about the Coastal Consistency Review, and from the United States Army Corps of Engineers regulatory program as well before we get into the discussion. I'm just going to move that off my screen. So with that, hopefully I didn't forget anything. Otherwise, I'm going to get started on living on the lakeshore. But first, let's talk about what New York Sea Grant is. We are the organizing organization today. We are a network of integrated research, education, and extension services with an eye on promoting coastal economic vitality, environmental sustainability, and citizen awareness of the state's marine and Great Lakes resources. We're one of 34 of these university-based programs throughout the United States and territories. New York's kind of a unique one in that we have a marine and a Great Lakes group. So we have 5 or 6 staff up here in the Great Lakes that serve just Great Lakes communities, and that can be anywhere from hazard resilience for the coastal communities, individual property owners, municipalities, safe and sustainable seafood supply, coastal tourism, coastal development, and maintaining those healthy coastal ecosystems and fisheries. For the New York Sea Grant offices in the Great Lakes, we're located in Buffalo, Newark, Oswego, and Ithaca. So we have a pretty good geographical reach as well, though we do have state specialists that kind of just travel all over. And this meeting is brought to you by an agreement between New York Sea Grant, New York State DEC, and MOU that we have in regards to Great Lakes education and outreach. So we are all here today because we are lakeshore people, whether we are people like me that just like to monitor what's going on and help people live in it in a certain way, or those of you that have family properties that have been on the lakeshore for many decades, sometimes up to 100 years. But we are in changing times, and it is becoming a changeable environment on the lakeshore. And, part of New York Sea Grant's role is to help you adapt to those changes. And today the focus will be mostly on the shoreline erosion and flooding that we see in the Niagara and Orleans County regions. And most of that is bluffs. So the Niagara Orleans shoreline is heavily bluffed. That's very steep, very tall banks, mostly made of glacial lake sediments. I don't want to get too much into this because, you know, there's not a whole lot of us that really care about what's there, but it is very important for what is actually going on the lakeshore, why the erosion is the way that it is in certain cases. And the reason it is because of that way is because Lake Ontario used to be, you know, about 10,000 years ago, much, much larger. See this little blue line right here is where the lakeshore used to be. And everything in here is kind of these lake sediments that were dropped down before the lake level dropped down. And those are very easily erodable by the waves of Lake Ontario. And that's not just because of high lake levels, but it's also because they form these steep bluffs, and that's also susceptible to rainfall, sheet flow coming off the bluffs, and a bunch of different other, you know, little nuanced parts of like living on the lake and just the lakeshore processes. So these bluffs are susceptible to both high water and wave events, and sometimes both at the same time. Some mechanics of bluff erosion, and we're going to have some more resources coming out on bluff erosion from New York Sea Grant in the coming, you know, months, probably next summer. So you'll have more opportunities to learn more about how bluffs erode. But most of it is because of the wave action on the lakes, and it comes in and it cuts away at the bottom. This causes slumps and slides. So we end up seeing a lot of very rapid erosion in these bluff environments rather than slower day-to-day type erosion that we see in, you know, cobble and sandy beaches. We also have to consider a lot of other factors besides the waves, and that includes the rain that's falling on top of the bluffs and how that interacts with the bluff once it permeates through and into the sand layers, meets a clay layer, can't go past the clay layer, so it moves out to the surface and causes more weight and more easily erodible material on the bluff face itself. I don't love this diagram a lot. I promise I'll come out with a newer one that's a little bit more intuitive in the future. But I did want to show you what this looks like in action. So this is actually from Wayne County a few years back when the water was very high in that area. So what happens, the waves come in, they attack the toe of the bluff. And we're going to say toe a lot today. And that's going to be this area where you see the waves crashing into the shoreline and the subsequent steep scarp that happens when that bluff material becomes saturated, heavily eroded, more so by the waves, and drops off in very large chunks. So this actually in eventuality leads to some of the fastest eroding shorelines in New York State. Another example of that, this one is actually in Ontario County, where this shoreline is just slowly eating away. This bluff here is slowly working towards this heavily mowed, heavily trafficked disc golf area. But at the lakeshore where we see the waves coming in, it's actually eroding very quickly in very large chunks. These are the kind of things we want to avoid, especially when we're working with individuals' properties. We want to make sure that this is safe and that we're not losing huge chunks of shoreline all at once. For those of you that live in these situations, you may have noticed that there are sometimes cracks along the top of the surface. That's a good geologic way of knowing that you are dealing with an active slope, so a heavily eroding, quickly eroding slope. It's that release of pressure cracking can often be a sign that you have a slope that is moving towards the lake a little bit. So how do we address that? Well, one, there's no good one-size-fits-all technique for shoreline protection. We really do look at this on a case-by-case basis. There are hard options that include revetments such as rock riprap, poured concrete seawalls, and sheet pilings made of steel or wood. But there are also softer options that include drainage improvements, surface water capture, terracing of the slopes. That means just reducing the slope, making it a little bit flatter, but also using strategic vegetation. I mentioned back in that bluff image that a lot of times it's the water action on the bluff face that causes a lot of the erosion. If you have a bluff that's not too steep, you can actually use vegetation to help slow that erosion. There's a wider range of options between hard and soft, and all those can be hybridized with natural and nature-based features as well in a way to beautify the shoreline, but also restore some ecological process as well. For New York's bluffs, it's a little bit harder to use pure green techniques. These are usually more very quiet water type areas, but there are times in which you can use vegetation and edging and sills. But also, if you are working with a bulkhead or a revetment that's already there, you can kind of work that vegetation into it as well. And you're not totally limited to structural options. You can just, make slight changes here and there. You don't always have to do the very hard approach. But why does it matter? Why do we care about these green or different newer type technologies? We're really looking at the functionality of the coastal processes and the ecological nearshore processes. And it's been well over 100 years where we've poured a lot of concrete and rocks on the shoreline, and that's really been to the detriment of replenishing the near shore. And when I say near shore, that's kind of like the beach area where you're going to be wading, swimming, and so on. That area usually should be sandy. The waves during storm events should pick up that sand, bring it to the shoreline, and make it a more equal or more even transition from lake to land. We're missing that right now, and a lot of that is because we've simply put way too much human interaction on the shoreline, and in turn that's kind of led to almost total habitat loss in some areas for shoreline critters and plants. But it also, we need that there to help restore the system and make sure that that sediments are still there, so that we can build up the shoreline, we can build up these barrier bars and so on to make this a more harmonious shoreline in Western New York. And what you see on the right here, this is just the Army Corps' sediment budget for the lake. In these areas where it's green, you have sediment coming in from the tributary sources, and for the most part it's pretty consistent across the shoreline. A lot of what we're thinking about today is what this looks like up close on smaller parcels. So some of the options, I'm going to go over a few of them that are available to you. I'm going to start out with this rock riprap wall. This is a very old rock riprap wall that it was installed on Lake Erie. This is actually in the state park. And you can see over time that this riprap, that's these big, large limestone or dolostone boulders. They eventually kind of become part of the beach here and have worked in with the native vegetation. This is kind of what I mean, where you don't have to pick one or the other all the time. You can use these hybrid type options. So I don't think this was intentional, but it kind of works out the way that it is. It's providing protection for this building you see here in the background, but also it's allowing for some ecological process to happen as well. You will also see poured concrete walls and revetments. I like to use this picture because it shows us quite a few different things. Now this is out in eastern Lake Ontario, so it's not quite where we're talking about today, but it does show some important processes. What you see here is that these waves are coming in, they smack into this wall, and you can feel these waves on a strong day really smacking into that wall. You can feel that pressure that comes off it. And for the most part, a lot of that splashes up and over, and it kind of saturates this area behind. That's fine as long as you have these, what we see are weep holes in this that allows the water to drain from the land side. So you want to make sure if this is something that you need to resort to, that it is being structured in that way so that it can actually counteract what's happening behind it as well. But we're also seeing here, you notice how it's kind of dark gray behind this. What's happening here is the waves are coming in. A lot of it is splashing straight up. A lot of it is also scouring straight down, and it's deepening that area and pulling that sediment away from the wall. And in very severe situations, we could actually see it get to the point where it undermines these features and causes a lack of stability among them. Always have to talk about steel sheet piles. This is kind of the worst case scenario. In this case, this is in Mexico Point, New York. This is at a boat launch facility. This is a spot that absolutely needs to be stabilized because it is a safe harbor, so it has to be accessible to emergency vehicles, and that includes boats, police and fire boats that need to use this. So in some cases, you absolutely need to strengthen the shoreline in areas like this, and that's how you do it. Getting back into the greener options a little bit, I did want to talk about terracing a little bit because I do see Niagara and Orleans counties as excellent potential areas to try this a little bit more. And I have seen a little bit in recent years. And this is really just a reduction of the slope. You see the cross line here. This is the way things used to be before the slope was reduced and flattened a little bit. That would have been a very unstable shoreline just based on the angle that it forms of the lake. You might need some shoreline toe protection just to make sure these are extra stabilized. That's something for you to figure out with contractors and DEC during the permitting process. But for the most part, you can use this terracing option to reduce the slope, revegetate the slope, and make that vegetation a lot more stable because it's not growing on such a steep slope and it's not as susceptible to rainfall events. And that leads to just more soil stabilization. And in a lot of cases, you still maintain a view because what you're planting is down below. But when you are considering these shoreline options, you want to make sure that there's a community approach being taken. One, because it's organized, it's going to help you in your permitting process, that you have people working together, and that speaks strongly towards wanting to do the right thing. It's a way to combine resources. We know a lot of these construction projects tend to be extremely expensive, but also it creates this non-combative type way of building up the shoreline. So you see in this upper right image that, one person decides not to do anything, but the neighbor decides to, go really strong with a really heavy riprap wall, and that could in turn result in wave reflection, a lot of erosion on the unprotected properties. So that could be an issue. But when you work together as a community, you can kind of think this through a little bit more and make a more harmonious choice between you and your neighbors and the environment. But we also do want to mention some long-term shoreline planning. These are more non-structural. So there are things you can do to reduce your risk, one of which would be elevating structures like you see on the picture on the right. Interesting part of this is that this isn't even the closest building to the lakeshore in this area. There's a road in front of this and a whole line of cottages in front of it that are much more at risk, but these homeowners are taking a very, very proactive, forward-looking approach to elevating that property and not having to worry about it in the future. Other things you could do would be relocation of buildings. So this is a newer building. In some cases, if you're going to build by the shoreline, don't build anywhere close to the shoreline because you just don't know how much it's going to erode in 10, 15, 20, 50 years down the road. And for the municipal folks that have joined today, there are ways to work this into your zoning and setbacks, your local codes that can make your communities a little bit more resilient to future shoreline change. And if we're talking about 20, 30 years down the road, relocation, retreat sometimes is something we do need to talk about because there's just no options left for some shoreline properties. So where do we get started? Well, one thing we do want you to do is to thoroughly evaluate your situation beforehand before just cramming a quick and dirty permit through the mail slot at DEC. We want you to work with your neighbors, get started early, talk to multiple contractors, talk to DEC, talk to New York State Sea Grant, because we are here to help and we are here to answer questions, especially myself. This is my job, is to help folks like you on the call today, to help make better decisions, to map out your path towards stabilizing your properties or preparing your properties to be more resilient in the future. We do want to put some warnings in here to not get experimental, because I've seen some wacky stuff in my time with New York Sea Grant on the shoreline, especially Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Anywhere from crane operated weights or blocks of cement that are placed on the shoreline to be removed at a later date that tend to kind of stick around forever, all the way to riprap installed completely wrong, 90 degrees instead of nice and flat within the lake bed, and just making things a whole lot worse. So we want to make sure that you are not getting experimental, that you are following those DEC, DOS, and Army Corps permitting processes, and that you're also looking much farther into the future, not just, we had one storm, we had a little erosion, let's blow the shoreline up and pour concrete all over everything. Let's try to think about this in a long-term way. I do have some additional resources that I wanted to mention that are available from New York Sea Grant. You can get to these by visiting the link right here. I didn't want to put links to all of them, but we will do a mailing later after the workshops that gives a little bit of delivers these to you. This is our first time doing an online version of this. So normally I would just hand these to you, but that's not the way that we can do things right now. One is the erosion management for New York's Great Lakes Shorelines. It's a 26-page document, I believe, that details a lot more of these shoreline erosion protection methods, and goes into the coastal process influences, the ecological influences, cost considerations, construction considerations, ideal situations. There's also a working with nature guide, so that if you are comfortable with diving into the more nature-based way of doing things, then you can do that. That's a plant guide with about 44, 48 native plants that are available either locally or in other ways that you can use to help stabilize your shorelines. We also offer virtual and in-person site visits. In person's a little sketchy right now, just the way, sign of the times. But we are here to help. We are here to walk through your property and say, this is where my concerns are. These are the things that you should be addressing. And just contact me directly with those if you would like. And at this point, that is enough for me. I'm now going to hand it over to New York State DEC, unless there are some specific questions. Mary, do we have any questions right now?
No questions in the chat, so maybe we just wait a second or two to see if anyone has any.
Okay, I'm going to try to keep us as on time as possible and just move forward. So up next, we all have DEC talking about their permitting process and also the coastal erosion hazard areas. We have 3 speakers from DEC today, and I'm going to introduce them quickly here before they get started, and you guys can just transition. The first will be Rob Call. Rob Call is the Deputy Permit Administrator for Region 8, and he oversees the natural resource permitting for an 11-county area, including Orleans. Rob graduated with a degree in geological sciences from the University of Buffalo, and he worked in New York State DEC's Division of Environmental Permits for the last 6 years. After Rob will be Elizabeth Geldard, and Beth is the Coastal Erosion Hazard Area Program Co-Coordinator for DEC Division of Waters, and works in the Western Flood Protection and Dam Safety Hub in the Avon office. She has served as the technical lead for New York State DEC's Western Flood Hub CHOP program since the inception of the hub over 7 years ago. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Engineering from the State University of New York at Buffalo. She is a licensed New York State professional engineer. So when you have engineering questions, talk to Beth, not me. I'm a geologist. And finally, for DEC, we'll have Christina Hope. Christina is a biologist with the Bureau of Ecosystem Health in New York State DEC Region 8. She received a BS in biology from RIT and has an MS in environmental science and biology from SUNY Brockport, where she focused on wetland ecology and migratory bird physiology. She worked at the DEC as a wildlife technician for several years before becoming a VEH biologist in 2019. Her focuses include Lake Ontario and the Finger Lake Shoreline projects, stream restoration, and wetland projects and restoration initiatives. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Rob. And Rob, just tell me when you want the slides advanced and we'll go.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to put it on the first slide. or the next slide. Yep. Okay. As Roy mentioned, I'm with the New York State DEC permitting office, and I'll spend a little bit of time going over the 3 ways of getting a permit from the department. The options that are available are a general permit, B is an individual permit, and C is an emergency authorization. The general permit is available for folks that meet a set of prescribed conditions. So these are conditions that the DEC has sort of discussed previously with OGS, DOS, and Army Corps of Engineers, and sort of agreed upon that really the criteria in that general permit sort of minimizes the impacts to the lake. And admittedly, for sort of flooding events like we've had in 2017 and 2019, we try to shepherd people towards this general permit. The emergency authorization, which is sort of third on the list, is for sort of emergency immediate threats to life and property, such as homes about to fall into the lake or something to that ilk. And an individual permit is really our standard process for everything else. So as mentioned, in terms of review process, the general permit is the quickest and easiest way of really getting authorization to do shoreline work, as it has been defined in a set of screening criteria. The department uses these criteria to make the project review easier and essentially provide a general framework on whether a project is allowable in our permit standards. And our colleagues of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and DOS has given their approval. So if a project meets the general permit criteria, essentially their approval is default. So as applicants come to us, the first question is, can we fit your project under a general permit? So the next slide. So what are these criteria? So number 1, repair or in-kind replacement of existing functional shoreline structures. So that these are sort of repairs of revetments or things that aren't going waterward of the pre-existing footprint. So this is pretty common, and probably 80% of our general permits are in that criteria. Essentially, people adding rock to their existing shoreline protection structure, or doing sort of elevation increases on their sort of concrete break walls. Another sort of option you can utilize is new sloped rock revetments necessary for the protection of existing functional dwellings. So slope and height limits do apply, and just note that if you don't have a structure there, it probably doesn't qualify. So these are really to protect existing homes on the property. Another general permit authorization we can use is a repair of or reconstruction of existing public roads, bridges, and utilities and other public infrastructure. So this is really meant for municipalities, not necessarily homeowners, but it is something out there that you can sort of encourage your municipalities to use if your residential road is being threatened. We can sort of quickly respond to that. And also the emergency repair functional concrete or steel vertical break walls by the installation of sheet piling immediately adjacent to the vertical face. So if someone has a vertical structure like a concrete break wall, one thing that we can authorize is driving sheet pile directly in front of it as sort of a quick fix. And this is also pretty common, especially in the embayments. So for the next slide. So yeah, the other potential opportunities within the general permit include the minor grading back of slopes and bluffs, the repair or reconstruction of docks, stabilization of existing storm damaged dwellings, decks, and walkways, the reconstruction of elevated walkways or stairways for water access, removal of channel blockages on Lake Ontario tributaries, or Lake Erie tributaries for that matter, and removal of debris by motorized equipment. So if any of your projects is one of these, it's great. We can work with you to get a general permit. So next slide. To apply essentially, you really need to reach out to your regional DEC office. So that's, or at least for Orleans County, Region 8, or for Niagara County, that's Region 9. And the things that we'll immediately need would be a completed general permit application, and we'll be glad to send you a copy of it. It's also available online. Application, some current photos showing what the problem is along the shoreline, and some project plans. And related to the plans is typically both a site plan, which is sort of a top view map drawing, as well as a cross section showing what you have in mind. If the project meets the general permit criteria, there is no need to send the application to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or the DOS. So next slide. So the application form is pretty simple to fill out. Just shown in front of you are the 2 pages, and it's mainly asks for your contact information and permission to visit your property. The project plans are probably the thing that goes along with that. It's probably a little more daunting to tackle yourselves. Typically with a phone call or two with our DEC permit office, as well as work with your contractor. The contractors frequently prepare the project plans for homeowners as part of their proposal process, but that's probably the larger hurdle, and my colleagues in a little bit will show you sort of a couple example plans. But the form is pretty easy to fill out. Just enter your contact information, sign the form, and we'll get the process going for you. In the next slide. Yeah, if the project doesn't meet the general permit criteria, an individual permit would be required. In most cases, this is for new revetments or fill within regulated wetlands. The process is very similar, though something called a joint application is required, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the DOS are involved. The application process is all online, and you can Google joint application form and get both the instructions and the forms. Similarly, we would need sort of a completed application form, current photos, and project plans to go along with the application. So next slide. The last type of authorization is referred to as an emergency authorization, which is for things that are an immediate threat to life, health, general welfare, property, or natural resources. It only authorizes the minimum work necessary to overcome the emergency, and is valid only for 30 days. The department issues these typically after major storm events, if someone's house is at risk, or if there's a sort of immediate flooding risk related to a road or a bridge. While we don't have a standard form, we need much the same information, typically your contact information, justification on how it constitutes an emergency, pictures, and a plan as far as what you're intending to do. Sort of the challenge for the emergency authorization is that it is the minimum work necessary. So it would be the sort of the break wall to protect the house, but not necessarily everything else that you may want to propose as part of your shoreline work. So this is pretty much as a last resort emergency plan. But all right, next slide. So as far as when we get an application into our office, we look at permit issuance standards is the one key term. For work along the shorelines, department staff applies Article 15 protection of water standards. So whenever we get something into us, the proposal needs to be both considered reasonable and necessary. It must not endanger the health, safety, and welfare. And the proposal must not cause unreasonable, uncontrolled, and unnecessary damage to the resources of the state. So essentially, if you're proposing a break wall or some kind of revetment, it can't cause sort of undue erosion on your neighbor's property. It is one of the key sort of questions that we always sort of pose when we get an application in. And next slide. And for other jurisdictions that we may have, depending on the location, Article 24 wetlands and Part 182 threatened and endangered species require sort of minimizing and avoiding the impacts itself, evaluating of alternatives, demonstrating that what is being proposed is the only practical alternative, and mitigating uncontrolled impacts. For wetlands and endangered species, we do our best to try to get people to avoid the impacts whenever possible. In the next slide. And for this Article 34 Coastal Erosion Management, I'll sort of hand it over to Beth Geldard, who's our coastal erosion engineer.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, so I'm going to basically describe the coastal erosion management regulations and the permit requirements. In 1981, Article 34 of the Environmental Conservation Law became effective, and it basically empowers DEC to identify, map, and develop regulations for certain activities within designated coastal erosion hazard areas. Article 34 is implemented by DEC under Part 505 Coastal Erosion Management Regulations, which is essentially a permitting program for the regulated activities that are located in our mapped coastal areas. So most activities within these areas do require DEC permits. Common activities that require permits from DEC include excavating, filling, dredging, the construction or modification of any type of structure or erosion protection structure, and the removal of vegetation. And really the purpose and intent of these regulations is to protect and preserve the coastline's natural protective features. And these are your nearshore areas, beaches, dunes, bluffs. And the other purpose is really to limit the amount of new development on these features. Limiting the amount of development on the features, protects the features, but it also ensures new development is not prematurely damaged due to active erosion and the impacts of coastal storms. So before conducting a regulated activity within an identified coastal erosion hazard area, you must first obtain a coastal erosion management permit from DEC. A DEC permit can only be issued provided that the regulated activity meets our permit issuance standards. So before developing plans for a project, we really strongly encourage that residents contact DEC because some activities may be restricted or prohibited within these areas in order to protect the natural shoreline features. The permit issuance standards for all shoreline activities are that the activity must be reasonable and necessary, and all reasonable alternatives to the proposed activity have been considered. So for a new erosion protection structure, we would want to know why the structure is required at the site and what alternatives were essentially evaluated. Alternatives that should be evaluated prior to considering a hard erosion protection structure, such as like a break wall, a rock revetment, is no action. So what would occur if no action were to be done? Non-structural solutions, such as moving an at-risk structure further landward or elevating existing upland structures, and your natural and nature-based alternatives. And this would be restoring, existing dunes and planting them, or regrading a bluff slope to make it more stable and replanting. The proposed activity must also not likely cause an increase in erosion to adjacent areas, and it has to prevent or minimize adverse effects to natural protective features, existing erosion protection structures, and natural resources. So as discussed earlier on in the presentation, sometimes structures are placed in locations and it will have increased erosion consequences adjacent to those structures. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are maps showing they're examples of what a coastal erosion hazard area map looks like. And the exact location of a coastal erosion hazard area is determined based on the coastal erosion hazard area maps. The coastal erosion hazard area is made up of two jurisdictions. You have a natural protective feature area jurisdiction and also the structural hazard area jurisdiction. So I'm going to get into the natural protective feature area jurisdiction first. And these are essentially your beaches, dunes, and bluffs. And these areas are delineated on these maps with a dark solid line that runs along the shoreline. It's basically parallel to the shoreline. And it's that dark solid line there. This area is regulated from the landward limit of the dark solid line to a point where mean low water is 15-foot water depth. Within this area, new water dependent structures, such as like houses, garage, decks, sheds, and so forth, those are prohibited within this area. Activities that may be permitted include water dependent activities. So like shoreline access structures to get to the beach, erosion protection structures, new docks, things of that nature. The other jurisdiction is the structural hazard area, and those are delineated on these maps with a dark dashed line. And these are only mapped in areas where long-term average erosion rates are at least 1 foot or greater per year. So not all coastline areas have structural hazard areas. This area is regulated from the landward limit of the dashed line to the landward limit of the solid line on the map. So essentially the area in between those two lines. New development within this area may be permitted, provided that it's movable, which is a structure elevated on piles or piers above grade, so no subgrade spaces, and it has to be placed at least 25 feet landward of the natural protected feature area line. So the map on the right kind of illustrates where a new movable structure would be able to be permitted within a structural hazard area. And then all CHA maps can be downloaded at the link below. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a map that shows the location of all mapped coastal erosion hazard areas along Lake Ontario. The coastal regulations gives communities the ability to adopt and enforce their own local coastal erosion management law. So these communities would essentially regulate and issue their own coastal erosion management permits instead of the DEC. Communities that are locally administered are shown in red on the map, and the DEC regulated communities are shown in green. So as you can see in our county, all the communities are DEC administered, and in Orleans County or Carlton is the only DEC administered community. So if you're located in the town of Kendall or Yates, a coastal erosion management permit would be issued by your town. Keep in mind that even though a coastal erosion management permit would be required from your town, it's likely other DEC permits would be required, working near the water or if you're in a state regulated wetland. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to go over a list of items that you would need to supply to DEC when applying for a permit. So the first thing we look for in an application is really, for project justification and if the activity meets our permit issuance standards. So really describing the erosion rates that are taking place, the location of at-risk structures are very helpful for our review. We also need to know that all the alternatives to the activity were evaluated and considered. So for erosion protection structures, since they typically cause adverse impacts to coastal processes in adjacent areas, we really don't want to see those used unless all other options aren't achievable. So again, that's your no action alternative, moving at-risk structures landward, and our nature-based alternatives such as planting vegetation, rebuilding dunes, and so forth. We're also looking to ensure your project won't likely cause a measurable increase in erosion to adjacent areas. So limiting lakeward encroachment of new structures is typically required, as well as making sure structures are properly tied into adjacent structures and shoreline areas. Other general things that should be included are an aerial map, so we know where the project is located, a stamped and signed survey, so it's clear where the property boundaries are, and recent photos of the project site and adjacent areas where the project will tie into. Next slide, please. Okay, so additional information that needs to be included is a set of project plans, which would include a cross-section plan and site plan. These plans need to clearly show what the existing conditions are compared to the proposed work. So, more details on the plan requirements are going to be discussed later on in the presentation, but, really detailing, including measurements and, a really good plan that shows what you're proposing and where it is compared to like your existing house, the property boundaries, other structures, and so forth. That makes it a lot easier on our review if we understand exactly what's being proposed. You also need to include a description of the construction materials, methods and manner of placement, and how you're accessing the project area, information on quantity of materials used above and below mean high water, disposal locations for any materials to be removed, and lastly, long-term maintenance plan. This maintenance plan is something that's only required for working in coastal erosion hazard areas, and it's essentially a plan that describes how often you're going to be inspecting your structure, what you're inspecting for, and how any repairs will be made to ensure that structure has a reasonable probability of lasting 30 years. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is an example of a site plan and the general details that are required. So as you can see, you have your existing conditions, your property boundaries, the location of existing adjacent shoreline structures, location of your existing house, and then where your structure will be in comparison to that. Next slide, please. And this is an example of a cross-section in the details that would be required. So really outlining the existing conditions, where the existing slope is and how that compares to your proposed structure. And, of course, measurements, we need the height and length measurements of the revetment, any bank regrading or planting areas, how the toe would be anchored and embedded into the shoreline, size for the stone, the slope for the revetment, your drainage details, and of course, identifying the property details, so the property name and location is helpful just to keep the file organized. Next slide, please. Okay, so this photo was taken in the town of Porter, where a structure was at risk due to shoreline erosion. In a situation like this, you would really either need to move the structure landward away from the bluff edge or install shoreline protection. A no action approach really wouldn't work here. I think, within a few years, the structure would likely fall into the lake. So if given the lot depths, if they're adequate enough, moving the structure away from the eroding edge is really the best solution because it provides the best long-term resiliency, and saves on costs in the future for having to maintain a shoreline protection structure. If the structure could not be moved landward for whatever reason, potentially due to lot size, or if there's other restrictions on the lot that would prevent you from doing that, then this is when you would need to apply for a shoreline protection structure. Next slide, please. This photo was taken in the town of Carlton, and this is an existing wooden wall that was in need of repair. So in this type of situation, alternatives that replace the wall within the same footprint, which would eliminate any additional lakeward encroachment, should be considered. As part of application reviews, we're always looking to see what's the least impactful alternative and hence reducing lakeward encroachment as much as possible. You could also look into replacing the wall with a rock revetment. If for some reason this existing wall couldn't be removed and a new wall needed to be installed in front of it, we generally require that the face of the new wall be placed no greater than 12 inches in front of the face of the existing wall. So really trying to put that new wall in within a foot distance from that existing wall. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Christina Hope from our Ecosystem Health Unit.
Hi, everybody, and thanks, Beth. So we wanted to show you a couple of examples of projects that had been permitted and completed in the last few years. So these were both involved with the damage from the high water levels in 2017 and 2019. I believe these were both 2017 permitted projects, but we saw a lot of the same stories in 2019 as well. So I have an example of an individual standard Lake Ontario permit project and a general permit project. I don't have one for an emergency permit because those are just, they're so site specific and different. You should really, if you think you might qualify for an emergency permit, you should be giving our permits office a call pretty much first thing because things, again, are very situation specific. So yeah, so from this, hopefully you can see how things might look a little different depending on the situation. And you can see, like, we have example plans available for folks, but we really need to know this story about what is actually going on your property. You know, you live there, you see it, you've seen the changes every single day, but we need to be able to get the whole picture to know that what is being proposed is really going to solve your problems and is going to sort of have the least negative impact on the lake environment that you love so much. You know, that's why you're living out there, hopefully. So our first one is a standard permit in Orleans County. And so this was an existing bluff that had become severely eroded. There may have been some scattered large boulder protection out there previously. You can kind of see that on the aerial photo, which was taken pre-high water levels. There was sort of a more gradual slope there and a concrete boat launch. But as high water and wave action really increased in 2017, things really eroded quickly and pretty dramatically. So this photo on the left is one of a handful that were sent to our office as part of the permit package. And so it's a little tough to see things because this was happening while the water levels were still high, but you can see the boat launch there, and then what was basically happening at the edge of the boat launch and running on either side of it down the shoreline is that gradual-ish slope had really just become a vertical deteriorating situation. And so I think we can go to the next slide. And so this was our proposal. Well, not ours. This was the landowner and their contractor's proposal for sort of remedying the situation. So because of the level of new work, there was no existing protection. Essentially, there may have been some boulders there. And with the amount of lakeward encroachment that essentially this would need to make a stable rock revetment, this particular project needed to be permitted under an individual Lake Ontario permit. And so just some of the things that were included in this top view plan that are really important. You can see where the shoreline is, where the property lines are, where the cottage sits. So, you know, you can kind of orient yourself when you're on the property or just sort of looking at it like this. And then you can see the proposed revetment itself, the area of erosion sort of behind it, where I'll show you on the next slide where they were going to do some restoration of the yard essentially. And then some dimensions of the new revetment and a boat ramp extension that they were proposing. One thing that I definitely wanted to point out is that they have two what we call benchmark measurements that go from the cottage corners to one goes to the boat ramp and then one goes to the eastern limit, the property line of this project. And so sometimes those get left out of initial permit applications, but things like that are really important because they tell us exactly where this project is going to sit in relation to the existing shoreline and mean high water and the things that we can measure from if we come out and do basically an inspection after the project is done. Let's see, what else do we have? It's pointed out that this is going to tie into the neighboring rock revetment on the next property over. And folks have mentioned we need to see projects designed in a way that are not going to negatively impact their neighbors. And so in this case, their neighbors already had a rock revetment, and so they could tie it right into that. And we know that we shouldn't get any additional erosion on the neighboring properties. Next slide, please. Okay, so since we essentially had two different features on the shoreline proposed here, this project needed two cross sections. And so what we have here are basically what those cross sections are going to look like. It's a slice right down through the proposed structure. And this especially should include a lot of dimensions on it. So what we have here is kind of the basic layout of a rock revetment. Again, there was nothing here shoreline protection wise. Basically, there was a vertical face and just the water kind of pounding into it. And so we've got everything included here that we need. You can see the shoreline. There are measurements for the height of the rock revetment and the width to show that it's being built at a stable slope. The largest stone at the front, the toe, that's the toe stone, that's keyed into the shoreline about 12 inches. And this is doable in most places on Lake Ontario, but sometimes, for instance, if you're in an area that's just straight bedrock, that stone might be pinned in with metal pins. And your contractor will go through these options and things with you, hopefully, and then we'll figure out the sort of the best path for your particular situation. And let's see. Oh, yeah. So the area of the yard that's being sort of filled and being reseeded, that's pointed out pretty specifically. It's up to 12 inches of soil and grass seed and dogwood plugs, those nice deep-rooted woody vegetation that's going to help to keep your shoreline together. And the materials are pointed out, and you've got a line for the mean high water line of Lake Ontario, which is something else that we look for. And similarly, because the boat ramp is being replaced, but it's being extended, so it's not quite an in-kind replacement. That's just provided here as well with the different dimensions and sort of where things are being added. So yeah, so this is the sort of thing that we would be looking for in our cross sections, just that it gives us sort of the best idea we can have about how things are going to compare to existing conditions. So next slide, please. All right, and so this is sort of the after or sort of in progress. You can see the excavator is still out there putting stone together. So yeah, this is a much more protected yard than what folks had previously at this property. My one critique of this is probably the stones are kind of placed almost stepwise. So they're not as, you're not getting as much of the varied faces on them to help break up wave action. But this is a nice big structure. The stones do look locked together pretty well. And so they're going to provide a good amount of protection in this area. And then, yep, and then you've got the nice boat launch, which has had a board put up for a little bit of overrun protection as well. So yeah, so that is one example of an individual Lake Ontario permitted project. And if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about a general permit. So not to give you vertigo, but this project is actually from Monroe County, but we see structures like this sort of all over the place in our region. So let's see, as you can see on the right, we've got some homes relatively close to the water and a little bit of a slope downhill, but there is an existing pretty tall, I think all concrete wall. There is existing stone protection there, as well as a little deck and stairs. And so again, this was some older aerial photography, and these folks had been seeing with the high waters and wave action, some damage and some dislodging of the revetment that they did have. So again, the photo on the left is one that was submitted along with their permit application. It was taken from the little overhanging deck, and you can see their poor wooden stairs are just sort of broken off and have landed in the water. And the stone doesn't look very well organized. It's kind of suffered some damage and washed out a little bit. And so what these folks proposed, and something that fit under the general permit, was rearranging the existing stone and then adding a little bit to it. And so we can go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so I was able to fit these onto one slide. So on the left, again, we have a top view plan. And again, you've got the property lines, the location of the main structure, the home, and those benchmark measurements, in this case, to either end of the proposed revetment. The concrete wall was not changing, and so that could just sort of be there as kind of another benchmark, as well as the deck. So structures that are existing and aren't being changed, those should also be called out on the plans, just because then we might go over for an inspection and say, whoa, is this a new dock or a deck or something? We didn't know anything about this. And that could raise a few questions. But so that's just something that you want to make sure you include if they already do exist. The stairs essentially were no longer existing by this point, so they're not included, and they were not going to be replaced in this case. I'll talk about that in a minute too. The rest that's on the top view plan include the area of the existing revetment, the added layer of 4 to 6 ton armor stone. And so that's pretty much most of what, or all that we needed on that particular top view plan. So on the right, we have just one cross section for this one, which shows again the existing the wall, an outline for the little deck that's remaining, and just sort of seeing where there are existing steps and where the home is in relation to the work being done. In this case, you have existing dimensions for the stone that's there, knowing that things have been a little dislodged, that's fine. And they're only about 12 by 4 feet. And so it's very clear on this cross section how much the size of the revetment is going to change. So we're going from 12-foot existing to 16-foot proposed. That's about the width of a nice big 6-ton tow stone, which again you can see is towed in a little bit into the lake bed on that side. And then it's also being raised to a height of about 8 feet, which is going to provide more protection. And it's at sort of a gradual slope, which is also something that we look at. So trying to think of other things that we might want to include on here. This particular work was being done by barge, and so we didn't need to have an access route shown on these plans, but the fact that it was done by barge would need to be included. These folks were not replacing the stairs down to the beach in this case from their deck, but if they were, those would need to meet those coastal erosion requirements just for basic beach access essentially. And yeah, so essentially this was just protection of an existing vertical structure that needed a little bit of help. And so with the sort of rearranged and expanded rock revetment, the vertical structure should last a lot longer. It won't be suffering from scour, especially during those high water times. And so it should really expand the lifespan of what these folks had. So hopefully they're in a little bit of a better situation now. And so just to do a little bit of a quick comparison, I know that, oh, actually, yeah, there's one more slide. Sorry. Yep, so you can sort of see my aerial imagery here wasn't the best, but there is definitely more stone protection existing along this wall now. And then you can see it rises quite a bit higher than the original sort of scattered revetment did. And so just to kind of summarize a little bit, so general permits are used for relatively low impact projects that use acceptable methods that have pretty, again, minimal impacts on areas where we have jurisdiction. Not all projects are going to fit under the general permit, but it was written to cover sort of the most common lakeshore projects and ones that we've seen a lot of, and we know that they're going to last. contractors tend to know how to do them pretty well. But even though they're pretty straightforward, we still do need those details in the plans. A lot of permits come past us, and so we really need to know the story of what's going on at your property. And we're a very busy office, but we are definitely willing to help you work through this process, whatever sort of permit you might be looking for. So, all right, next slide. That's it for me.
Okay, I'm not quite sure how we're doing on time, Mary. I see there's 6 questions or comments happening. Do we want to?
So the question, so Kate had a question about how to find the mean high water mark on her property, and Beth was able to put in a link to the homeowner guidance to talk about an example for that. And so we do have some time, Roy. So I don't know, maybe Kate, does that answer your question sufficiently? Or is there something else related to that you might want to ask while we've got time? She said she's good.
Awesome.
Yep, so all of that was handled in chat while while we were going through presentation. So thanks, Beth, for responding to that so quickly.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you to DEC for that very informative presentation. We are going to move right along to Department of State and Matt Moraglio. Matt is a Coastal Resources Specialist at the New York State Department of State and a supervisor in the Consistency Review Unit. He's been with the department since 2008 and has a range of responsibilities and interests, including shoreline management and coastal energy siting. Matt has previous experience with land surveying, stormwater management, and natural stream channel restoration. So Matt, if you want to get started, I'll advance some slides for you.
Thanks, Roy. Appreciate it. And obviously I have the OPRHP listed on here as I borrowed this from a previous presentation, so apologies for that. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So I'm going to go through a couple topics today, starting with Federal Coastal Zone Management Act review and talk about how the New York State Coastal Management Program was developed and brings these 3 components: federal consistency, state consistency, and local consistency review, all into New York's regulatory scheme. So I always like to start by saying this is the nerdiest sounding regulatory program you've ever heard of. So federal consistency review, and I push my glasses up to settle on the point. So federal consistency review is a term of art that's found in federal regulations. We didn't make it up ourselves, so I'll blame it on the federal government here. Next slide, please. And next slide again. So back in 1972, this guy here, same era as Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, those types of landmark environmental regulations. Richard Nixon signed into law the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act. Next slide, please. And what that did was it encouraged the coastal states, so there's 39 of them, to develop coastal management programs. And they incentivized this participation by providing federal funding to implement that coastal management program and design it, and provided them with a type of regulatory authority, and that's federal consistency review. And essentially what that said is that there are certain federal activities that cannot be undertaken without a state's consent. It's a form of reverse federalism, which gives the state authority over the federal government. And if you need help sleeping one night, feel free to browse to 15 CFR Part 930, and that will tell you everything you need to know and more about where federal consistency came from. Next slide, please. So New York State took 10 years to develop their program, and part and parcel of developing that program was the Coastal Erosion Hazard Area Act that Beth was speaking to earlier, and Article 42 of the New York State Executive Law. Those 2 laws were instrumental in allowing the coastal management program to be approved by the federal government. We're going to focus today on authoritative issues. So this is like permit issuance. And the main federal entity that issues those permits that we are engaged with is the Army Corps of Engineers. Know, however, that there are several other types of federal activities that require our review, such as direct actions from the Army Corps of Engineers, if they were to be undertaking a dredging action, funding from a federal entity to a state or local entity, such as HUD providing funds, and outer continental shelf plans. So these are offshore wind farms. And know that the state uses this federal consistency authority as one means of implementing its plan. We're not the only regulatory authority, obviously. You have other entities on this training here that have their own permit programs and regulatory programs that further the state's interest in managing its coast. Next slide, please. So as I said, New York State implemented its program in 1982, and it's a networked program, meaning that it takes multiple sets of state laws and policies and regulations and combines them into one cohesive document. Many other coastal states have their coastal management program sitting in their Department of Environmental Conservation equivalent, or their DEP or their DEC or whomever. New York elected not to go that way and cited its coastal management program with the Department of State as a planning body. We are kind of unique, although not completely unique, in that we have multiple special management areas. And I'll go into a little more detail about them later. But know that they're LWRPs, or local waterfront revitalization programs, significant coastal fish and wildlife habitats, the Long Island Sound Coastal Management Program, and the best one of all, SAS, who loves that name, Scenic Areas of Statewide Significance. Next slide, please. And next slide. So a local waterfront revitalization program is a municipal-based refinement of the New York State Coastal Management Program. Anytime that an activity is within a local waterfront revitalization program community, department staff's required to solicit comments from that municipality and utilize the policies found in that document in lieu of the state's coastal policies. Only those activities, only those areas that have a federal approval are binding on federal agency actions. And know that there are some local waterfront revitalization programs outside of the coastal area that aren't necessarily binding on federal actions. But for our purposes here, they're all federally binding. Part of that local waterfront revitalization program is that municipalities' development of their own local consistency law. So your municipality, if you have an LWRP, likely has a law that requires them to be consistent with their coastal management program, their local waterfront program, if they have a permit to issue you. Next slide, please. Significant coastal fish and wildlife habitats are special management areas that are designated by the Department of State upon recommendation by the Department of Environmental Conservation. And we provide special protections to these areas based on specific characteristics. They go beyond just DEC and DOS, and that they incorporate federal comments and then are federally recognized as part of New York's coastal management program. Once you're conducting an activity inside of a significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat, Policy 7 of the New York State Coastal Management Program now applies. So now your activity must be consistent with that particular policy. Know that the whole habitat is considered. It's not a species specific review. It takes more into account of the whole habitat rather than a specific species. Next slide, please. And finally, SAS, I'm going to mention this just because I love saying it, but there are only SASs in the Hudson Valley and East Hampton, so they're not applicable to Lake Ontario and Lake Erie at this time. However, they could be should the department decide to incorporate them into that area. That has not occurred, and nor do we have any intention of doing that in the near future. Next slide, please. And again, for the sake of being complete, there is a regional coastal management program in Long Island Sounds that we won't go into detail with now. Next slide, please. So our jurisdiction extends to the coastal area. So broadly speaking, that's everything that the tide touches. Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, St. Lawrence River, Niagara River, connecting embayments, and roughly about 1,000 feet inland from these waters. Those boundaries generally follow a road or a park boundary or some other natural or artificial or political boundary. In order for the Department of State to have a review of your action, it has to be within or affecting this area, and the action has to have a federal component. Next slide, please. So I said we'll focus on permitting actions here. And so for the purposes of federal consistency review and permitting actions, including those state or municipal actions that need a federal permit, they have to be fully consistent with the coastal management program. And we have 6 months to review that particular action from the receipt of a complete application. Next slide, please. If we do not respond to you within 6 months of receiving a complete application, our approval is conclusively presumed, meaning that we have given you a de facto approval in our act of not reviewing your application. That is very few and far between that happens. We make a very considerate effort to make sure we have a decision to you. So if you're applying for a federal permit, you apply to us concurrently with your submittal to the Army Corps, which generally is concurrent with your permit application to the DEC. And you provide us with an additional certification that your activity is going to be conducted in a manner that's fully consistent with the coastal management program and its 44 coastal policies. And then we're going to do a couple of things. We're either going to concur with that certification, conditionally concur with that certification, or object to it. If we object to it, then that federal agency, in this case, the Army Corps, is not able to issue a permit. Now, that 6-month time clock that I mentioned before, there is a mechanism for us to hit the pause button if you as the applicant and ourselves mutually agree to hit that pause button. Next slide, please. Now we have several mechanisms to say yes to your project. First off is a general concurrence. We've developed a list of criteria, and that's in our coastal management program, that if those general conditions are met, you're eligible for an expedited review, and there is a quicker regulatory process for us to reach that decision. We also enter into agreements with the Army Corps of Engineers for their nationwide permit program and their regional permits. As Rob and others at DEC went through in some detail, the general permit for Great Lakes erosion control incorporates our nationwide permit decisions such that our review is not required if DEC is issuing you a Great Lakes erosion control permit. So for ease of installation purposes, the greater dependence we can place on utilizing that Great Lakes erosion control permit, the better. So again, if your action is authorized under that general permit, you do not even need to send in a federal consistency assessment form and a permit package to the Department of State. The Army Corps of Engineers also has regional permits, which I'll let them go to in whatever detail they choose to later on. However, know that we review those regional permits. We at the Department of State review those regional permits. And there are specific situations where our review is not required should a regional permit be issued by the Army Corps of Engineers, and that's detailed in the permit documents. Next slide, please. If those situations aren't met and a full review is required, then there's a public notice process that gets undertaken by the department. And we will then concur with your permit or concur and identify conditions that need to be followed in order for that concurrence to be valid. If those conditions aren't followed, and consequently your federal application is not amended to reflect those conditions, that approval automatically turns into an objection. And an objection means that the Army Corps or whatever federal permitting authority cannot issue you their federal permit. Next slide, please. And I'll mention the complete application process for us, which starts our 6-month time clock, consists of all of this info here. Others have stated what types of materials they need. Our list is very similar. So a completed federal consistency assessment form is the only additional thing that's required beyond what the DEC and the Army Corps already require. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the federal consistency assessment form, which you may or may not have seen before. But what this does is lays out a series of yes or no questions. If you were to answer yes to any of these questions, those numbers in parentheses dictate the coastal policy that may be affected. So for every question that you're answering yes to, you're going to go to that coastal policy that's listed in the question and write a narrative statement to us stating how your project is going to be consistent with that particular policy. Next slide, please. And the last page of that form has the certification on it that you are making to us. So you sign this signature block here, then our action is to react to your certification. So we are concurring with or objecting to your certification. We're not issuing you a permit. Next slide, please. I keep mentioning the coastal policies, and that is what New York State Department of State bases its decision on. There's 44 coastal policies that broadly fall into these categories. We review your project and its consistency with each one of these particular applicable policies. And I could spend the whole morning going through how we interpret policies, so we'll leave that for another training. Next slide, please. I like to think I'm always right, but I recognize that I'm not necessarily. So there is an appeal process to our decision. However, it's at the federal level. So a federal agency cannot issue their permit over the state's objection unless that decision is overridden by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. And for that to happen, the Secretary of Commerce has to find that these three conditions are met: that the activity significantly and substantially furthers the national interest, that the interest outweighs the adverse coastal effects, and there's no reasonable alternative. No reasonable alternative is a very difficult standard to overcome, because in many situations there is a reasonable alternative to your project if it raises to the level of objection. And if your project raised to the level of objection, we would be working with you tirelessly to try to identify those reasonable alternatives and come to a solution with both yourself as an applicant and the other regulatory agencies to find something that's reasonable. Next slide, please. I mentioned the local consistency law. So here's just an example of the town of Wheatfields. They have a local consistency law that specifies what type of activities in their LWRP are required to undergo local consistency. And for the sake of completeness, I'll touch on state consistency review. Just know that that is not a responsibility of you as an applicant. That's a responsibility of the state agencies that are involved. But it's a way that the state has assured the federal government that it will hold itself to the same standards as it's going to hold the federal government to for the purposes of federal consistency review. And theoretically, local, federal, and state consistency all works in concert to make sure that federal, state, and local decisioning are all the same. Next slide, please. So for a list of our local waterfront revitalization program documents, please browse to this location. If you have this saved from previous trainings, know that the website's changed pretty substantially since the last training event. And you're going to need to scroll all the way to the bottom of this page to find ALWRPs. Next slide, please. Just going to give a plug for our Geographic Information Gateway, which provides substantive information, geographical information about New York's coastal area. And please browse to that website there. And next slide, please. And again, some other useful links when completing your federal consistency assessment form and a application package to us. If you have this saved from other trainings, again, substantive changes have happened to our website. So a lot of these links have changed. And with that, I cede the rest of my time to the chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Did any questions pop up during that session?
Nope, no questions in the chat.
All right, well, we're making great time, so we might as well just run with it. Well, I introduce our next speaker. Is going to be Shana Sauter. And she's a regulatory biologist with 12 years of experience with the Army Corps of Engineers, Buffalo District Regulatory Branch. She primarily works in the monitoring and enforcement sections and has experience in New York and Ohio permitting, also with a wide variety of water and projects. Shana plays a large role in outreach for the regulatory branch and has elaborated on this experience by serving a year with the Corps of Engineers, Buffalo District Public Affairs Office. Prior to starting with the Corps, she earned her Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Forest Biology from SUNY ESF in May 2009. So I'm going to go right ahead.
Thanks, Roy.
And
Hi, so I'm Shana, everybody, and so we're going to go over the regulatory program and how it may affect your property. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the Corps of Engineers, we operate under two different authorities, one being Section 10 of the River and Harbors Act. It applies to navigable waterways, waters that are currently, historically, and could in the future represent opportunity for interstate commerce. So anything that's transporting goods or could contribute to the economy or the benefit to the public in that manner. So any work, all activities and structures within, above, or beneath, so in, over, under navigable waters are regulated, which means that you would need a permit to do any work in, over, or under these waterways. The limit of jurisdiction for navigable waterways ceases at the ordinary high water mark, extending and then extends to adjacent wetlands as well. For Lake Ontario, which it was mentioned previously in DEC's slides, they call it the mean high water mark for Lake Ontario. We call it the ordinary high water mark. It might be different in other waterways, but I'm pretty sure on Lake Ontario, we both operate 247.3 feet, International Great Lakes datum. In 1985, that's the year I'm looking for. So that's what you're looking for. That elevation is, if you're in, over, or under 247.3 feet for your project, then you're going to need an authorization from our office. Next slide, please. Second authority we operate under, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act of 1977. This applies to all waters in the United States. The regulations have been changing quite frequently with the definition of the waters in the United States. However, you can look at the current information for that online or 33 CFR 328.3, but essentially applies to navigable waterways, inland lakes and ponds that connect to other tributaries, rivers, streams, creeks, and also considering adjacent wetland areas. Discharges of dredged or fill material are what we're regulated under Section 404. So fill material can be anything that is changing the bottom elevation, anything that is like a hard structure or something that's not going to break down quickly. Dredged material, rock, sand, dirt, broken concrete, all considered fill material, precast concrete. So if you think it could be fill material, probably is fill material. Limit of jurisdiction ceases at ordinary high water mark in streams and rivers and lakes, or the wetland upland boundary. Differing from DEC, we do not have buffers on the wetlands we regulate. So once the wetland boundary is established, that is where our jurisdiction ceases. Okay. So permits, example of activities or structures requiring permits in any of these navigable waterways listed here docks, boathouses, or stone revetments, riprap, bioengineered protective structures, scientific measuring devices, break walls, jetties, groins, seawalls. Any of these things could or should require an authorization if the work is occurring in, over, or under the navigable waterway, or if there's a discharge of fill material associated with that in another water of the United States. Utility lines also over the Great Lakes or other navigable waterways because it's an over activity. Okay. So we have a couple different types of permits that you can get from the Corps. The most common one are general permits. We have in New York, we have regional general permits, which someone mentioned earlier, which I'm not going over. And I don't have a slide for, but regional general permit 87-00-1 is for docks and boathouses. Regional general permit 81-00-1 is for dredging, minor dredging projects. But the most common ones are nationwide permits, which are issued across the nation for general projects. Projects that are minimal impact have been determined by have already gone through a public notice process. And if the impacts meet those terms and conditions of those permits, then you can work under those permits. And in certain instances, you would need to notify our office prior to, in which case you would be submitting that joint application form that has been referenced earlier, because that is the form we use in New York. So nationwide permits 3, 13, and 19 are the ones that probably most interest you, people who live along the shoreline that have projects they want to do on the shoreline. Nationwide permit number 3 is for maintenance activities, repairs, rehabilitations, or replacement of currently serviceable structures or fills. Any minor deviation can be authorized under this permit. Nationwide permit number 13 is for bank stabilizations. We recognize that you need to be able to stabilize your bank and protect your property. So anything that has less than 500 linear feet and has 1 cubic yard of fill material per running foot of bank can be authorized under this permit. It does not allow for work in wetlands. And if you do need to do more than 1 cubic yard per running foot, there is a process to get a waiver for that. Nationwide permit 19 is for minor dredging projects, less than 25 cubic yards of material. No work in wetlands is allowed under that one either. And if you're planning to use that permit, you need to have an upland disposal location. No fill from the dredge, none of the dredge material can go into another water of the United States. Next slide, please. Okay, so those 3 permits that I just mentioned, nationwide 3, 13, and 19, if you are applying and get affirmed a DEC general permit 0-020-004 permit from DEC, then you do not need to contact the Corps except for in certain circumstances. Specifically, on the slide, it talks about, you can see below, these are all listed on our website also, but if you have certain areas have endangered species listed, and one of the things that we need to make sure is that we are coordinating appropriately for those things. So if you're proposing projects authorized in one of these circumstances below, then you would need to contact our office and DOS. But I think, as Matt said, if you are affirmed from the GP listed above, you do not need to contact the Corps or DOS unless it's one of these other circumstances. Tree removal in all towns in Jefferson County, activities federally regulated wetlands in the towns of Huron and Wolcott, Wayne County, activities in federal regulated wetlands in Cayuga and Oswego counties, activities within sandy shorelines in the town of Sandy Creek and Richland, Oswego County, activities within federally regulated wetlands or sandy shorelines in the towns of Henderson and Ellisburg, Jefferson County, and projects that involve the placement of stone below the mean high water line in excess of an average of 1 cubic yard per running foot of shoreline. Those are the instances when you should be contacting our office with a pre-construction notification to see if it needs further coordination or additional review. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the other permits that we also have at the Corps are considered individual permits. There's 2 of them, standard permits and letters of permission. Standard permits are a larger impact permit. So if you're proposing something that doesn't meet one of our general permits under the nationwide permits of the New York State regional general permits, then you could apply for a standard permit or a letter of permission. Letters of permission are for slightly larger impacts than what's covered under the GPs, and they have a smaller review process, but larger than the general permits, because we're taking into account public interest factors. You would still submit the required joint application form package with the location map, plan view drawing, cross-section drawing, description of your project, purpose of your project. And then there's going to be a coordination letter process. Once we have a complete application, we would coordinate with other agencies such as DEC, DOS, US Coast Guard, US EPA, and we also send those letters to adjacent property owners and seek comments from them. Once those valid comments are received, then we coordinate with the applicant to have them addressed if relevant. Similarly, for standard permits, like I said, these are for much larger impacts. So if you were proposing armor stone groins out in front of your property in Lake Ontario, that would be something that is more than minimal, something that we probably could not authorize under a general permit, and we would have to seek a standard permit, and you would have to provide alternatives. Why is this necessary? Is this considered the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative, which we call the LEDPA? We would need at least 3 alternatives showing why this is LEDPA to accomplish a project purpose. And we need to be able to determine that considering all the public interest factors. And then a public notice would go out, and there's a comment period for that. And that process typically takes up to 120 days or longer. We aim for 120 days, but depending on the level of documentation or how long it takes to get the proper alternatives, it could take quite a long time. For both individual permits and emergency permits, which is not something that we do that often, I don't think there is one activated for the shoreline at all, but emergency permits typically are for storm events. And DEC permits, water quality certification and DOS coastal consistency concurrence are required for these permits. Individual ones are. In our general permits, I forgot to mention that often there are blanket water quality certifications and coastal consistencies, and only certain terms and conditions, if you're not meeting them on those general permits, then you would need an individual water quality certification and DOS coastal consistency concurrence. Next slide, thank you. Consideration on permitting activities and structures. So I mentioned this earlier, but we recognize that the landowner has a right to protect their property from erosion. Erosion is a natural process, but we don't want to see your structures falling into the water. But we do have to follow the regulations and consider the public interest in the waterway as well. Consideration of and balancing the following factors: need for the project. Why is this project needing? Is there really a threat to the structure or the shoreline, or is it just something you want to do future planning? Is there, you see erosion occurring down on the west side of your property and you want to prevent it from happening on your property? Those are things that we would need to know when you submit your permit application. Navigation impacts. What you're doing, is this going to impact the navigable waterway and how it processes? Are people going to be able to easily navigate around that area, or is it going to cause a safety hazard? Impacts to up and down drift properties. This is something that was mentioned earlier. The more we harden the shoreline or stick groins onto the water, it's changing how the drift moves around in the lakes, especially on the Great Lakes, and it's causing increased erosion up and down drift, mainly down, typically whichever way it's going. And then we're also not seeing that buildup of sand that used to occur, and people are wondering where their beaches are going. Human impact has definitely altered how littoral processes have changed, and those are considerations we're taking in when we're evaluating these permits. What other effect could your project have on the aquatic resource? Is it changing the wildlife habitat? Are there other environmental factors we need to consider? And the effectiveness of the protective feature, I think somebody else in DEC was talking about trying to make sure that, it's something that's going to last for a long time. It's not going to be something in 2 years down the line, it's completely eroded into the lake, and now we have all this loose fill in the lake, and we want something, and then you guys have to sink more money into your projects. So you want a project that's going to last. It's not something that, you know, back when I first started back in 2010, 11, I think we were having in Lake Erie, we were having a lot of cliff dumpers and people were just getting free fill and trying to dump over the line. And we had to do a big outreach to stop that. And, you know, that was just bad because it wasn't protecting anyone's bank and it was just material that was eroding into the lake. So we discourage that, and also things to consider when we're evaluating permit applications. Next slide, please. So as regulators here at the Corps of Engineers, we are charged by the legislators to kind of act as a middleman and or middlewoman and make sure that you are in compliance with all sorts of other statutes. One part of our job. So we have to fully understand your process and your project so that we can coordinate with these other agencies, state and federal, to make sure you're in compliance with Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, which is water quality certification. In New York State, it's held by the Department of Environmental Conservation. As indicated previously, some of our general permits have blanketed water quality certifications in them. For individual permits and letters of permission, you need individual water quality certifications. In New York State, we also have to coordinate for the Federal Coastal Consistency, which is a coastal zone management program, which Matt just reviewed. We have to coordinate for Section 7 Endangered Species Act coordination. This is any endangered or threatened species listed in your area. We have to make sure there's no take and no threat to habitat alteration, anything that can be considered a take under Endangered Species Act. So that's a coordination process we have to fulfill as well. Consideration of historical properties under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which in New York is the SHPO office, State Historic Preservation Office, is New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. So we need to determine if there's any, like say one of your houses had a significant historical event associated with it and it was built 200 years ago. Well, we need to consider, is your shoreline project altering the aesthetic view of that, and does it have any impact on that historical structure? Is it eligible for listing under a National Historic Preservation Act? That's another thing we have to coordinate for. Those are the most common ones that we coordinate for frequently, but these are the things that we are doing that might slow down the permit process, and this is why, as someone else indicated from one of the other agencies, it's early to start this process early when you know you have a project to do. Other coordination and statutes that we have to make sure we're in compliance with, your project's in compliance with, is the National Environmental Policy Act, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which I don't think in this part of the state, New York, has any federally listed rivers, the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, and often any navigable concern from the U.S. Coast Guard. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so that's just a really fast, brief overview of what we do here at the Corps. So are there any questions? And yeah, there are some resources there on the next slide if you want to just skip to that one. Go ahead, Mary, sorry.
No, that's okay. There is one question in the chat asking, would I need a permit to build a boathouse on the bluff?
Okay, so that's a good point. We don't regulate the shoreline, but we regulate in, over, and under the ordinary high water mark. So if your boathouse is going over the elevation, like it jets out over the water at 247.3, then you would need a permit for a boathouse. But if it's up in the upland portion of the bluff outside of that ordinary high water mark, then you would not need a permit from the Corps. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, from a DEC perspective, you would possibly need a coastal erosion permit depending on whether the bluff is a regulated coastal erosion feature. So.
Yep, it looks like that answers the question.
Okay, well, as far as a lot of the things I talked about, they can be found on our website under the New York Permit Information tab. And there's also a Lake Ontario water page for the Corps, for the Buffalo District, and that has the information about what's covered under the GP-0-020-004 permit from DEC and how our permits fold into that and when you should contact us. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Shayna. So we have finished the presentation portion of today's workshop. We do have time to take on additional questions if you want to put them in the chat. I also have a few queued up that I thought might just be good for the listeners that might have just some further details on a few more things. And I'll throw this one, I think, to either DOS or DEC. Matt, I think it might help to mention the gateway, the GIS gateway here. But in talking with property owners, they often look at me blankly like, am I in a wetland? I don't know. How can the residents determine if they are in a wetland or not?
So that's probably best answered by folks at DEC and their environmental resource mapper.
All right, I'll give it a shot. So, yep, so both DEC and Army Corps regulate wetlands, although we kind of go about it in different ways. But generally, we map them in the same or very similar ways. So one good way to see if you might be in or near a wetland is to use the New York State DEC's environmental resource mapper. It's available on our website. It's GIS based. And so if you just go to the website and search for resource mapper, it should pop right up. Yep, Mary's got it in the chat. Thank you. So it's a really great resource for seeing a lot of different just environmental things. But when you're looking at potentially permitting something, it will show you I think it'll show you both federal national wetland inventory maps and state wetland maps. So, and an associated buffer area. And so I always need to mention this. Those maps are they're for informational purposes. They were made in like the 80s based on aerial imagery and other information and things like that. And so the nice green blobs that you see on the website, those aren't necessarily the exact boundaries of the wetlands. And so if you are in or near one of those blobs, you should definitely contact our office and maybe also the Army Corps. And then we can kind of take a closer look at conditions and see if you might be in a wetland, or we might be able to say right off the bat after doing like a desktop review, like, no, there's no wetland concerns here. If there might be, or you really can't avoid being near or in the wetland, then a requirement for DEC is to have something called a wetland determination or wetland delineation performed. And so this is essentially officially going out into the field and flagging the boundary of the wetland that's on your property. And so for individual homeowners, our DEC office can do that for you. And I think Army Corps sometimes does as well. But in some cases, folks might want to have what's called an environmental consultant do that for you. There are various firms and some basically individual small businesses who can do this. And they use the processes that we use to determine where those wetland boundaries are. Those would still need to sort of be reviewed and approved by us. But that is another option because DEC at least can only do those certain times of year. We kind of go by vegetation and soil qualities and things like that to see exactly where the line is. And so long story short, the environmental resource mapper is the best starting point to see if you might have concerns. But if it's if you're in that green zone or it's sort of there's really any question, you should definitely give our office a call to see sort of the best way forward for taking those wetlands into account. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, similarly from the Corps, if you have a thought that there might be wetlands along your shoreline, if this is a shoreline project, I would recommend calling our office. We don't have a wetland mapper like DEC does. And that's one of the most common misconceptions I get when people call, well, your mapper shows that there's no wetlands here. I'm like, well, we don't have a mapper. There is a federal the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service puts out National Wetland Inventory Mapper, and that is online and people can look at that. But again, I'm pretty sure those are done by an algorithm in a computer. And the first, they have a disclaimer as soon as you get on it that says these are not accurate boundaries. These are suggestions. And they're just meant for informational purposes. And I've been to sites where it said the whole thing was wetland and it wasn't. And I've been to sites where there was nothing and the whole thing was. So, I mean, they can check the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wetland Inventory Map and look at that. But, if they're just looking at the DEC mapper, that wouldn't cover all the wetlands we regulate, because we regulate anything that kind of like flows anywhere. And then if it's abutting Lake Ontario and it's below that 247.3 elevation, it'd be considered a Section 10 wetland. So I would again recommend they call the Corps and just ask that question if they really think that there's a possibility of wetlands there. And if they have no clue, call anyways. Thanks.
I think it's also relevant to mention just one of the larger DEC wetlands is Saranaquat Bay. So if you're on the shores of Saranaquat Bay, you are very likely in a regulated DEC wetland.
And Megan just popped in chat a Fish and Wildlife Wetlands Inventory Mapper. So that might also be helpful for folks too. Any other thoughts about wetlands before I move on to another question in the chat? Okay. Another question is there concern about the invasiveness of Japanese knotweed along the shoreline in Kent? I don't know if any of the speakers are prepared to respond to that. Anything about invasive species?
I'll go and say that while I'm sitting here in my house and I can look out my window and see a big pile of knotweed. So I'm always concerned about stuff like that. And I've spent a lot of time in the Catskill Mountains chopping down knotweed inside the New York City DEP watershed. So that said, I think we're all concerned during any regulatory process about spread of invasive species, that we'd want to be careful to make sure that it spreads contained. That said, I'm not aware of any specific programs in Kent or focused on Kent to alleviate any Japanese knotweed. I defer to others if they're knowledgeable of any specific programs.
My first thought would be contacting your local PRISM office, which I believe that would be Western New York PRISM. I don't know exactly where the boundary is. They will have pretty comprehensive guides on these invasive species management. When thinking about knotweed on the shoreline, though, it often requires the whole plant and the extensive root system underneath. And in doing so, you're going to expose a lot of easily erodible sediments to the lakes and potentially creating other erosion issues. So that's a good time to plug our Working with Nature Plant Guide, which if you are reestablishing one of those surfaces that has a list of grasses, shrubs, trees that you can put in relatively quickly and restabilize those easily erodible shorelines, especially if you're trying to clean up something like Japanese knotweed or Phragmites, or in some cases, stilt grass.
There are no more questions in the chat, Roy. I'm just adding some links to the Western New York PRISM, and I also am not sure if Kent is in Western or Finger Lakes, so I'll add that too. And I also wanted to add the New York State Invasive Species Research Institute, so they may have best practices for specific species, knotweed or others, if that's lacking at the individual PRISMs. And while we were just talking, another question came in. How do I become aware of any funding opportunities that might be available or come up?
So there are very few funding opportunities for individual grants. The consolidated funding application has funding opportunities for municipalities generally for Department of State's purposes, and they're more focused on planning. So these would be municipal grants to help communities develop local waterfront revitalization programs, or if you already have a local waterfront plan, for grants associated with your management of that program. There were some funding rounds related to high water events in 2017 and 2019. They're generally listed on the governor's website, things of that nature.
Yeah, as far as the Corps goes, the federal funding projects that come through the Corps are usually larger projects that are for the overall public good. And, you've seen some of those along the Lake Ontario shoreline in the last couple of years, more specific to like the harbors and maybe something related to Ready, but I don't think so. I know we had the emergency one out in Fairhaven, New York, where they were able to stabilize what do they call that? The pier out there and exiting Little Sodas Bay. But that's just an extensive project that has to come from a municipality. And then it has to go through a feasibility study and be approved. And then there has to be stakeholders, a local stakeholder that's a portion of the funds, and then the federal funds come with that. It's not for individual property owners, unfortunately. But if it was like individual property owners, it was part of a local municipality public interest thing that was submitted, I'm sure that's something that could be considered.
I'll also put a plug out there. New York Sea Grant, in partnership with DEC, coordinates a small grants program that anticipates having funding on an annual basis, and usually notification goes out about that for resilience work. So, you might maybe like a feasibility study or something like that might be something that would fit under that. So watch for those notifications after the new year, probably January, February, March. Anything else funding before I go into the next question? The chat is lighting up, folks. Okay.
Emily just dropped another link for Community Approaches Nature-Based Shoreline Projects. Very good stuff.
Perfect. And Roy, are you gonna collect all of these and send these out to folks? All the comments, the links?
Yes, I will do that.
Okay, perfect. Okay. The next question, are permits required to make minor repairs to an existing seawall in Yates County? Areas under the seawall eroded away to be filled with cement?
I can cover this one. So for this specific question about areas underneath the seawall, those areas are likely going to be below your mean high water level. So a permit is always required. Article 15 permits always required from DEC. And this activity specifically would likely be able to be covered underneath your general permit, since it's a minor repair. So you wouldn't need to coordinate with the Corps and Department of State. So yes, you would need a permit for that specific example. If the work was above your mean high water level and you were located in a coastal erosion hazard area, you would need a permit, provided that that repair is changing the design or size of the structure. If you're simply repairing like a crack and filling that in, and you're above the mean high water level, you that would be considered normal maintenance and you wouldn't need a permit. So it's really dependent on the exact activity that you're doing and where it's located.
So that was specific to Yates County. So I'm assuming that is on one of the Finger Lakes. And I would say, like she said, the ordinary high water mark for the Corps, mean high water for DEC, you would need a permit. I would recommend, if it's purely maintenance, like you were indicating, to check out Nationwide Permit 3 to see if the 404 permit, Nationwide Permit 3 could cover your project, and whether blanket water quality certification is in that for specific to your project, if it meets those terms and conditions. If you had questions about that, I'd be happy to answer them individually.
So for Department of State, Yates County is outside of the coastal area. So unless you are doing something really, really huge that would affect the coastal area, there's no reason for Department of State to be involved at all for coastal consistency purposes.
Okay, looks like that question is sufficiently answered. Other questions in chat?
All right, it looks like there's no other questions. At this point, I would like to thank our speakers today, Rob, Beth, Christina, Shayna, and Matt. Thank you so much for being a part of this. And also thank you to the residents that signed on today to express some of their concerns and get their questions answered. You guys are really what drives these workshops, and we're always working to make these as informative to you as possible. So any comments you want to leave, that would be great. We will be sending out evaluations at a later date to usually I hand those to you and don't let you leave without filling them out, but I can't do that now. So please be on the lookout for those. For those interested, we are holding another workshop on Thursday for Lake Erie, if that falls into your area of concern. So, register the same way you did for this, just sign up for the Lake Erie one. And if we have no other further questions and no other comments, I will say good afternoon to the rest of you and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you all.
Also now going to stop recording. So thank you, everybody.